Greenland, a few years before the year 1000. A man in his 20s is standing on cold shingle, agreeing a price for a used boat. He does not know it yet, but this one decision is about to make him the first European in recorded history to set foot on the continent of North America. 490 years before Columbus. He also does not know that within 15 years, everything he is about to build over there will be abandoned, and the whole thing will disappear so completely that the world will spend the next 900 years insisting it never happened at all. He just knows the boat has already been somewhere. 14 years ago, its previous owner got lost in a storm, came out the other side of it staring at a coastline that should not have existed, and turned around without ever setting foot on it. Leif Erikson is not going to make that same mistake. He hires 35 men, he loads the boat, and on a morning with no ceremony and no king watching, he sails west into open ocean with no compass, no chart, and no idea what is actually waiting for him at the other end. If you came here to fall asleep, you're in exactly the right place. Get comfortable, and if you feel like it, drop your city and the time right now in the comments. There's something that genuinely makes me happy every time I see someone listening from Tokyo in the middle of the night and someone else listening from Toronto in broad daylight. And all of us drifting together, let's go with him. 3 days out, the sky closes in. North wind first, then fog, and then more fog, and it does not lift. Not that day, not the next, not the one after that. To understand what that means on this ship, you have to understand that these men have no instruments. None. The magnetic compass will not reach northern Europe for another 200 years. Everything they have is built on being able to see. They sail by the height of things. The sun at noon, one star after dark. You hold that height, and you run west, and you keep holding it day after day, and that is your entire method. When the cloud sits down on the water and takes the sun and the stars away, you have nothing left but the swell under the hull and the flight lines of birds, and if the birds are not flying, you have the swell. And then the swell changes, and you have nothing. There is no shelter on this boat. There is no deck to go under, and no cabin to close. 35 men are sitting in an open hull in the North Atlantic with water coming over the side, sleeping in leather bags on top of the cargo when they sleep at all. And every one of them knows exactly what is happening. They are not sailing anymore. They are being moved. Nobody knows how many days it lasts. The account does not say, and the men who lived it are not around to ask. What the account does say is that when the weather finally broke and the fog came apart, there was land. And it was wrong. Not wrong like unexpected. Wrong like impossible. They were looking at a coast of enormous flat grey stone slabs running straight down into the sea, with glaciers standing behind it, and not one living thing growing anywhere on any of it. No grass, no scrub, no trees, nothing. Leif took a boat in and went ashore anyway, and the line the account preserves about that moment is one of the driest things in the whole of Norse literature. He looked around at this dead grey country and observed that at least, unlike the man who'd seen it before him, he had actually put his feet on the place. Then he named it for exactly what it was. Helluland. Flat stone land. And they left. Most scholars put it on Baffin Island, or the northern tip of Labrador. Beautiful country. Completely useless to a farmer. If you have ever travelled a very long way to see something and known within 30 seconds that it was not what you came for, you already understand the mood on that ship as it pulled away. So they turned south and kept the coast on their right hand and sailed on, into water no European had ever charted, with the food going down and the season moving on. And after some days the grey stone ended, What replaced it stopped the ship. Long white sand beaches running for miles, and standing up behind them, forest. Not scrub, not brush. Forest. Tall, straight timber, densely packed, going back further than anyone could see, and running along the rail at walking pace for an entire day's sailing. You need to know something about these men to feel what that was. They came from Greenland. Greenland had no trees, not a shortage of trees, essentially none at all. Every roof beam in every house they had ever lived in had crossed an ocean to get there. Every plank, every barrel, every tool handle, every ship. If a boat was wrecked, you did not build a new one, because there was nothing to build it out of. Wood in their world was not a material, it was an import, and it was rationed, and it was the reason people could not simply build their way out of a bad year. And here is a wall of it, free, belonging to nobody they can see, going past them for a whole day. They named it Markland, forest land, almost certainly the coast of Labrador. They went ashore, and I want you to picture what that landing was actually like, because it is not the heroic version. 35 men who have been sitting in salt water for weeks, whose hands are cracked, who have eaten nothing but dried fish and whatever they can catch, coming up a warm beach into a stand of timber taller than anything in their entire world, in complete silence, with nobody there. That is the moment this stops being a voyage and starts being something else, because they now know the first land was not a fluke. There is more out here. The map their entire civilization is carrying around in its head is wrong, and it is wrong in their favor, and they are the only people alive who know it. They did not stay. Leif wanted to see what else was down there, so they put the timber behind them and sailed south again, and 2 days later the coastline opened up and let them in. There was a sound between a low-wooded island and a green headland. They took the ship in through it on a rising tide in shallow water, and they got it wrong. The tide went out from underneath them. The hull came down on wet sand, tilted over, a long way from the waterline and stuck fast. No damage, but no movement either. They were beached, and they were going to stay beached for 6 hours minimum until the water came back for them. And they did not wait. Every man went over the side into knee-deep water and waded in across the flats toward the shore. That detail is sitting in the oldest account we have, remembered and passed down by word of mouth for 200 years before anyone wrote it on a page, and it is the most human thing in the entire voyage. 35 exhausted men, a stranded ship, 6 hours of nothing to do, and not one of them willing to sit on that hull for another afternoon. They came up out of the water onto grass, and that is the moment. Not a sighting through weather, not a rumour brought back by somebody else. Boots in the soil of North America, roughly 490 years before Columbus was born. They walked inland and found a river running out of a lake, and it was thick with salmon, and the account makes a point of saying they were larger than any of the crew had ever seen. Which tells you more than it looks like it does, because these are Icelanders and Greenlanders. Fish is not a novelty to them. Fish is the difference between spring and no spring, and they are standing in this river telling each other they have never seen anything like it. Then somebody noticed the grass. It was still green. Deep into the season, when everything at home would be dead and grey and the animals would already be locked up on stored hay, this grass was green and thick, and it stayed that way. Now, that sounds like nothing. It is not nothing. At home, the whole year is a countdown to the hay harvest. You cut and dry as much as you physically can in one short summer window, and if the weather turns at the wrong moment or the crop is poor, the animals die in the dark, and if the animals die, the family is not far behind them. Everyone on that ship had lived through a winter like that or knew someone who had. And this grass just stays. They stood in a country where the fundamental terror of their entire existence had been quietly deleted, and they made a decision that afternoon that tells you everything about how they were reading it. They did not build a camp, they built houses, full turf walled halls, the same as the ones they had at home, dug into the ground and roofed over. Men who intend to look around and leave do not build turf halls. Within days of getting ashore, these 35 people had already decided this place was worth a winter. Leif had one rule for the crew, and it was a survival rule, and he enforced it. Nobody goes further than they can get back from by dark. Nobody splits into a group too small to help itself. Because here is what they knew about where they were, and it is worth saying out loud: nothing. They did not know how big this land was. They did not know if it was an island or a continent. They did not know what lived in the forest. They did not know whether the winter here would be mild, or whether the green grass was a trick that would kill them all in January. They did not know if anyone else was here. They were 35 people, on a coast nobody in their world had ever walked, with one damaged boat and no way to send for help. So the rule was, stay close and come back before dark. And then one evening the count came back wrong. Somebody was missing. The man was called Turka, and he was not one of the young ones. He was old, and he was not even Norse. The account places his origin somewhere further south in continental Europe. He had been in Eric the Red's household for years and years, and he had helped raise Leif when Leif was small. Leif called him foster father. Now think about what a missing man means in that specific situation. You're on an unmapped coast. It is going dark. There is forest on 3 sides of you, and you have no idea what is in it. You have no maps, no signals, no way to search a large area, no way to call out to anyone but each other. If a man goes into those trees and does not come out, you may simply never learn what happened to him. And the man missing is not a crewman. It is the old man who raised the person in charge. The account says Leif was angry and worried, and that he organised a search party immediately and went out with it himself. Torches, into the tree line, calling. They did not have to go far. The old man came walking out on his own. And something was badly wrong with him. He was talking too fast in a language nobody in the search party spoke. He was rolling his eyes. He was laughing at nothing at all. Leif could not get one coherent sentence out of him, and for several minutes stood there in the dark with his hands on the man's shoulders, genuinely believing that his foster father had been injured, or had a stroke, or had lost his mind out there in the trees. It took a while before the old man could get himself under enough control to speak Norse, and what he said was that he had found grapes, wild grapes, growing untended all over a hillside back there in the dark, and that he knew exactly what they were because he had been born somewhere they grew, and that he had eaten so many of them and let a little of the juice work on him that he could not stand up straight. An old man, decades, and an ocean away from the country he was born in, living out the end of his life on a frozen rock where nothing grows, in somebody else's household, eating dried fish, and he walks off into a forest at the edge of the known world and finds the taste of his own childhood growing wild on a hillside where nobody from his world has ever stood, and sits down and eats until he cannot speak. They named the entire country after that night, Vinland, Wineland. Hold that name because in 900 years' time it is going to become the single biggest unsolved problem in this whole story. Grapes are not decoration. Grapes only grow in certain places, and when people finally dig Norse buildings out of North American ground, they're going to find them somewhere grapes cannot grow at all. We will come back to that at the end of the night. They wintered there, and the winter was mild and no one died. In the spring they loaded the ship until it could not take any more. Timber packed into the hold, grapes dried or in casks, and still more wood dragged behind on a tow line because the hull was full. And on the way home, one more thing happened that is the reason for the nickname he carries in every account. They spotted a wreck on a reef, 15 men clinging to it in open water, with no realistic hope of anyone coming. Leif took the ship in and got all 15 of them off, and salvaged their cargo as well and carried them home. That is why the sources call him Leif the Lucky, not for finding a continent, for that. He came into Greenland with the most valuable cargo anybody in that colony had ever seen, 15 rescued men, and a story about a country where the grass stays green in winter, and the fish are the size of your arm, and there is more timber than 100 colonies could ever use. He was about 30 years old. He was rich, he was famous, and he had found the answer to every single problem his people had, and he never went back. Not that spring, not the next one, not once, ever, in all the years he'd left. He inherited his father's position, ran the colony, grew older, and every single year the fjord ice broke up, and the sailing season opened, and there was a ship on the beach and open water all the way to the horizon. And he stayed, 20 springs, give or take, watching the ice go out. That is not the man on the statue. That is a man who worked something out and never talked about it, and you are going to find out what it was, but not yet. Because other people did go back. His family kept sending them, and the second voyage is where this story stops being a discovery and starts being something much harder. The next one out was Leif's brother, and his argument was hard to refuse. Leif had seen one bay and one winter. Nobody had followed the coastline. Nobody knew whether this was an island you could walk around in a week or something with no end to it. Nobody had gone inland. For all anyone in Greenland actually knew, they had built 4 houses on the edge of a country the size of the world. So he took the same ship, the same hull, now on its 3rd Atlantic crossing, and 30 men, and went back to find out. They found Leif's houses standing exactly as they had been left. Nobody had touched them. They moved back in, and for 2 full years they used that settlement as a base, and went out from it, west one summer and north the next, tracing coastline that no European eye had ever passed over. And the account of those 2 seasons reads almost like a holiday. Wooded islands, white sand, good harbours, fine timber everywhere, and then, in one place, they came across something that should have changed everything, and did not. A wooden structure, built for storing grain, standing in a clearing. Not driftwood arranged by chance. Not a natural formation. Something made deliberately by hands for a purpose, by somebody who intended to come back for what was inside it. Read that again, because it is the single most important sentence in the first half of tonight. Somebody lives here. Not somebody lived here once. Somebody lives here now, and stores food here, and will return for it, and is very possibly aware that 30 foreign men are currently walking around their country cutting down trees. The account states it in one line and moves straight on to the next thing. It does not stop. Nobody in that party seems to have sat down and thought about what it meant. That failure to stop is the hinge the entire story turns on. The following summer, sailing east and north, the weather caught them. A storm drove them onto a headland hard enough to break the ship's keel. The spine of the boat, the piece everything else is built onto. That is not a repair you make at sea. That is the kind of damage that ends expeditions, and in the wrong place, ends crews. They got the ship up on the beach and rebuilt it. and when the old broken keel came out, the brother had it set upright on the point, standing on end as a marker. He named the place Keel Point. He seems to have genuinely fallen in love with that stretch of coast. There is a line in the account where he stands looking out over a wooded headland above the water and says out loud that it is a beautiful place and that he would like to make his home right there. Remember that he said it. Hold on to it. It comes back in about 4 minutes, and when it does, you're going to wish it had not. They repaired the ship and sailed on, and rounding a point, they saw 3 low humps on the sand of a beach. They rowed in closer. They were not humps. They were 3 boats, hide-covered, turned upside down on the shore, and under each one, 3 men were sleeping, 9 people, asleep in the early morning, under their own boats, on their own coast, in a spot their people had almost certainly been using for longer than Greenland had existed. Everything pauses here, because the next 60 seconds decide the rest of this story, and they are nearly always disposed of in a single clause. We do not know who those 9 men were. We do not know what nation they belonged to, what language they spoke, what they called themselves, what they were doing on that beach, where they were heading, or who was waiting for them to come home. The Norse sources give every indigenous person they ever meet exactly 1 word, and it is not a name anyone used for themselves. It is a Norse word that sits somewhere near wretches. That is the entire vocabulary we have been left. What we do know is that they were not alone out here, and they never had been. That coast had been continuously inhabited for something on the order of 12,000 years. There were nations on it, with borders and alliances and law and trade routes running hundreds of miles. There were people who knew every river mouth and every crossing, and exactly which week the fish arrived in which bay. Knowledge built up over 400 generations. The Norse had been standing in the middle of all of it for 2 years, cutting timber and calling it empty. Here is what they did. They split into groups. They surrounded the 3 boats. They took the men, and they killed 8 of them. 1 got away. He reached a boat and he was gone. There is no provocation recorded, none. The account gives no reason, offers no justification, and does not soften it. It states it in the same flat tone it uses for the weather, and moves on to the next event. That deserves a great deal more silence than the record gave it. 9 men asleep at the edge of a morning. 8 of them do not properly wake up. That is the first recorded encounter between Europeans and the peoples of North America. Not a meeting, not a trade, not a misunderstanding, but an ambush with no reason given in any surviving source. And every single thing that happens to the Norse on this coast from here on is a consequence of that morning. They went back to the ship and slept on the headland. And then the account does something strange. It says a voice called out over them in the night, telling them to wake up and get away if they wanted to save their lives. They woke to a fjord full of boats, not 3. The text says the water was black with them, coming on in numbers that made counting pointless. The one who escaped had reached his people, and his people had come. The Norse got the shields up along the ship's rail and fought from the water, arrows coming in over the top of the wood, holding a line they had no business being able to hold, and then it stopped. The boats pulled back and went, having done exactly what they came to do. The Norse thought they had come through clean. The brother went along the deck and asked whether anyone had been hurt. Nobody had, except him. An arrow had come in under his arm, through the narrow gap between the ship's side and the shield rail. He had not said anything. He pulled it out himself, And then he said one of the few genuinely bitter things anybody says in the whole of this literature. He said the wound was going to kill him. He told them to take the rich land he had wanted so badly. And then he said, more or less, that it seemed he was going to be living on that headland after all. Exactly as he had wished out loud a few days earlier, just not the way he meant it. He asked to be buried up on the point he had admired, with a cross at his head and a cross at his feet. They buried him there and sailed home without him. That grave is the first European burial in the Americas. He wanted that land. He got about 6 feet of it. And the view he liked is still doing precisely what it was doing that afternoon, and has been every day since for 1,000 years. The news went back to Greenland, and the family's response to a brother being killed on that coast was not to reconsider anything. It was to send the next brother. His mission was almost tender. He was not going to explore, and he was not going to settle. He took a ship and 25 men and set out to find his brother's grave and bring the body home. He never even reached the coast. Now, we have spent the night so far watching men cross this ocean successfully, and it is easy to start thinking of it as a road. It was not a road. Here is what the Atlantic actually did to a Norse ship when it wanted to. The account says they were driven about the ocean all summer, not days, the entire sailing season, blown, becalmed, blown again, with no sun and no landmarks and no way to fix a position, in an open boat, with 25 men on board and the food going down and no way to tell anyone at home what had happened to them. At one point they came close enough to see Iceland. At another point they saw birds that come from Ireland. Think about what that means for a second. They were so completely lost that in a single summer they wandered from within sight of one country to within bird range of another, hundreds of miles apart with no ability to steer toward either. And they never found the coast they were looking for. Not once. Never even saw it. Finally beaten, they turned for home and made landfall back in Greenland in the first week of winter at a settlement that was not even their own. And that winter, sickness moved through the house where they were staying. And the third brother died in it. So count what this family has now spent. One brother in the ground on a headland in Vinland with 2 crosses over him. One brother dead of fever after an entire summer of being pushed around the ocean by weather, having never arrived. And Leif, the one who actually found the place, still sitting in Greenland, still not going. But the third brother had a wife, and she survived that winter, and she is about to take over this story completely. Her name was Gudrid, and by the time she died, she had crossed the North Atlantic 8 separate times, in open boats, in a century where a single crossing could reasonably kill you. There is a serious argument made by serious historians that she was the most travelled woman in the medieval world, and quite possibly the most travelled person of either sex in that entire century. By this winter, she'd already survived more than most people in these accounts manage in a lifetime. She'd crossed to Greenland as a young woman, on a voyage that lost a large part of its fleet. She'd been widowed once. Now she was widowed again, in a house that was not hers, in a colony at the edge of the world. Into that same winter sailed a wealthy Icelandic merchant with a full ship and a good name. He wintered with Leif. He met Gudrid there. By spring they were married. And here the older of the 2 accounts says something that quietly rearranges everything. It says she was the one who kept raising Vinland, that she pushed for the voyage, the largest, best equipped, most serious attempt anybody would make to settle North America before Columbus appears, in the oldest source we have, to have been substantially her idea. Because this one was a different order of thing entirely. The first voyage was 35 men and a cargo run. The second was exploration. The third was a rescue mission that never arrived. This one was a colony. They sailed with multiple ships. The two sources disagree on the numbers, and you should have both. One says 60 men and 5 women. The other says 160 people in total. And they brought the animals, cattle, sheep, loaded down into the open holds of Viking-age boats, and carried across the North Atlantic, standing in the dark for weeks, being thrown against the timbers every time the sea got up, in a vessel with no deck over them and no way to get them out if things went badly. Understand what that commits you to. You do not haul breeding cattle across an ocean, unless you fully intend for their grandchildren to be grazing on the other side of it. They reached the coast and found Leif's houses again, still standing, and there is a small, revealing detail here. Leif would not sell them. He lent them, even while refusing for the rest of his life to set foot on that coast. He was carefully keeping his claim on it. And then, for a while, something happened that almost nobody ever tells you about, because it fits neither the heroic version nor the tragic one. It worked. The animals thrived on that impossible grass. A whale beached itself early on and fed everybody through a hard stretch. They cut timber, repaired the buildings, added new ones. They got through a winter. And then, one day, people came out of the forest. The account describes it carefully. A large group coming across the meadow toward the settlement, and the first thing that happens is that the cattle start bellowing at them, because these animals do not exist on this continent, and no one approaching had ever seen or heard anything like them in their lives. And both sides stopped and looked at each other, and nobody attacked anybody. What happened instead was a market. They traded. The people of that coast wanted the dairy the Norse were producing from those imported herds, which was something entirely new. They offered furs in exchange, thick, grey, superb pelts, exactly the kind that would fetch enormous money in Norway. Bundle after bundle of them for milk and cheese. Stop and look at what is actually happening on that meadow, because it goes past in a line and it should not. Two peoples who share no language, no writing, no religion, no technology, and no previous knowledge that the other one even exists, are standing in a field working out an exchange rate, by gesture, repeatedly, over a whole season, and it holds. The merchant made one rule and enforced it hard: no weapons. His men were explicitly forbidden to trade iron blades, and there is a moment where visitors point at the Norsemen's swords and axes and clearly want them, and he refuses. That could be dressed up as decency, and I doubt that is what it was. Iron was the only real technological edge these settlers had. 160 people at the far end of an impossible supply line, surrounded by a population they cannot count. Do not arm the neighbours. That is not conscience. That is arithmetic. But whatever the reason, the effect was real. For one season, on that meadow, two worlds met, and the sword stayed in the box. And into that arrangement, a child was born. Gudrid gave birth to a son in that settlement. He was called Snorri. And as far as any evidence has ever shown, he is the first child of European descent born anywhere in the Americas, around the year 1005, give or take, half a millennium before Columbus was born. The first European born in this hemisphere was not born after a conquest or during a war, or on ground that had just been taken by force. He was born inside a small settlement that was, at that exact moment, successfully sharing a coastline with the people who already lived on it. For one season, it worked. Genuinely, provably worked. And then it broke. And the way it broke is so stupid that if it were not sitting in the oldest source we have, nobody would believe a word of it. The trading party came back. Business was underway across the meadow. Furs on one side, dairy on the other, the same as it had been going for weeks. And the bull got out. The breeding bull. The one they had hauled across an ocean standing in the dark of a hold for weeks. Something in the pen gave way, and it came out of the trees at a dead run, bellowing. Stand on the other side of that meadow for a second. You're trading furs with a group of strangers who arrived in ships from somewhere nobody has ever heard of. You've been doing this for weeks, and it has been fine. And out of the woods comes an animal weighing most of a ton that does not exist anywhere on this continent, that no one in your nation has ever seen or heard in their entire life, roaring and charging straight at the group. They ran. Of course they ran. They dropped everything where it lay, got to their boats, and went, and they did not come back for weeks, and when they came back, they came in force. The account says the number of boats was enormous. It says they came up the beach carrying poles and swinging them and making great noise, and that the Norse understood immediately that this was not a trade delegation. And then the source gives one detail so specific and so strange that historians have argued about it ever since. They had a device, a pole or a frame from which they launched something, a large object, dark in colour. The account compares it to the size of a sheep's belly, that flew over the Norse line, came down among them, and made a terrible noise. Nobody knows what it was. It may have been a genuine catapult-type contraption. It may have been an inflated skin filled with something, used to terrify. Some historians think the detail got garbled across 200 years of retelling, and originally described something else entirely. Whatever it was, the Norse had never seen anything like it, had no answer to it, and they broke. They ran. Back along the river, looking for high ground and cover. 160 people, or 60, whichever count you take, running from a force they could not match, in a country they had held for 2 seasons, thousands of miles from any human being who could possibly help them, and one person did not run. Freydis was Eric the Red's daughter, Leif's half-sister, and she was pregnant. She came out of the settlement and saw the men going past her in retreat, and she shouted at them. She asked why strong men were running from people like these. She said that if she had a weapon, she would fight better than any of them. They kept running. She tried to go after them and could not keep up because of the pregnancy. So she was left behind, alone, standing on open ground, with an advancing force coming up toward her. She found the body of a Norseman who had been killed, with his sword lying in the grass beside him. She picked it up, and then she did the thing that nobody, in 1,000 years, has been able to explain. She turned to face them, pulled her clothing away from her chest and struck the flat of the blade hard against her own bare breast, screaming at them. The attackers stopped, and then they turned around, went back to their boats, and left. That is what the account says. All of it exactly like that. I am not going to pretend I know why it worked, because nobody does. Some have argued it read as a curse, or a supernatural threat, or something ritually appalling in a context we simply cannot reconstruct from this distance. Some historians think the whole scene was invented later by a storyteller who wanted a moment like that in his story. What is certain is that it sits there in the oldest text, written down without apology or explanation, and that the men who ran came back to find a pregnant woman standing by herself on the field with a sword in her hand, having ended the battle alone. The merchant praised her for it. That is recorded too. But praise does not fix arithmetic. and the arithmetic had just become impossible to ignore. The account puts the conclusion in the merchant's own mouth, and it is the clearest sentence anywhere in this entire literature. It says that although the land was excellent and had everything they could want, they would always live there in fear and in conflict because of the people who already held it. Read that again, because 1,000 years of retelling has managed to lose it completely. They did not leave because the land was poor. They left because it belonged to somebody else, and that somebody else had made the position unmistakable. They loaded the ships, furs, timber, grapes. The merchant, Gudrid, and their 3-year-old son, who had spent his entire short life on a continent nobody else in Europe knew existed, sailed east, and they never came back. And then, with no final battle, no siege, no last stand, no burning settlement, nothing at all worth composing a song about, the voyages simply stopped. That is the strangest ending available to this story, and it is the true one. Nobody was driven into the sea. The ships just stopped going, one family decision at a time, and that coast went back to being exactly what it had been the entire time, somebody else's country. So why? 4 expeditions, 15 years, hundreds of people, cattle, families, and the best open water sailors alive. Why did every single one of them end in a withdrawal from the richest ground any of them had ever stood on? 3 reasons stacked on top of each other, and you will not find them listed together in any one source. But across 15 years the pattern is unmissable. The first is distance. Vinland was not just far from Europe, it was far from Greenland, and Greenland was itself the fragile far end of a supply line that already ran Norway to Iceland to the outer edge of survivability. Every voyage west launched from a colony that could not reliably resupply itself. That is not a base of operations. That is a tightrope with a second tightrope tied onto the end of it. The second is population, and this is the one that decides everything. The entire Greenland colony, at its absolute peak, across its whole history, probably never held more than a few thousand people. Some estimates run lower, a few thousand spread across 2 small settlements on a frozen coast. Now try to garrison a colony across an ocean from that. Try to send reinforcements when a season goes badly. Try to replace the people you lose. You cannot. Run the numbers yourself, and you get the same answer they got. There was never a reserve. Every single person sent west was a person Greenland could not spare, and there were never going to be enough of them. Not that year, not in 10 years, not ever. And the third is the one the coin and the calendar leave out entirely, and it is the one this whole night has been walking toward since 8 men died in their sleep on a beach. The land was full, not empty, not thinly wandered. Full of people who had been on that coast for 100 centuries, who understood every river and every season of it in ways the Norse could not begin to match, who had their own alliances and their own weapons and a perfectly clear memory of what these newcomers had done the first time they met. And when those people decided the Norse were not staying, they were entirely capable of enforcing it, and they did. So here is the thing nobody puts on the coin, and I want it said plainly. Vinland was not lost. Vinland was defended, successfully, by the people whose home it was. The first European colonial attempt in the Americas was defeated in the field, and it stayed defeated for 500 years. The reason Columbus gets the date in the history books instead of Leif Erikson is not that Leif failed to arrive. It is that somebody stopped him. And now, go back and look at that man on the beach in Greenland one more time, watching the ice break up every spring with a ship sitting right there, and not going. He went once. He came home with a fortune, 15 rescued men, and a legend. Then his brother went and came back in the ground. Then his other brother went and came back dead, having never even found the place. Then his sister-in-law's expedition went with cattle and families and everything a colony needs, and came home with furs, a story, and nothing else. Leif was not a coward. Leif was the only person in that family who ran the numbers early and never needed to run them again. 20 springs. Watching the ice go out, staying exactly where he was. There are 2 endings after that, and they pull in opposite directions, and you should have both before this night is finished. The first belongs to Gudrid. She and the merchant took their son home to Iceland and farmed. Her husband eventually died. Her son grew up and married, and once he did, she did something that at her age, in that century, is very hard to account for. She walked to Rome, not sailed comfortably, walked most of the way, the length of Europe as a pilgrim. An older woman off a farm at the top of the world, on foot through country she had no language for, and then she walked back. You will sometimes hear that she sat down with the Pope and told him about a green country across the Western Ocean. I would love to hand you that. There is no proof of it. The sources record the journey, not the meeting, and honest historians say so plainly. Handing you a better story than the evidence carries is not something I am going to do, but the smaller true version is remarkable enough on its own. A woman who had given birth on a continent Europe did not know existed, crossed the Atlantic 8 times, walked to Rome and back, and then lived out her last years quietly on the family farm in northern Iceland, in a church her own son built for her. And there is one more piece to hers, and it is quietly enormous. Her descendants did not disappear into obscurity. Through that boy, the one born in Vinland, the line runs directly to several of the early bishops of Iceland, which means that for generations afterward, some of the most powerful churchmen in the North Atlantic were walking around with this as an ordinary family fact. Grandmother was there. The boy was born there. There is land across the Western Ocean, and our own family has stood on it. They knew, and nobody went. Not the bishops, not their sons, not anyone they told. The knowledge sat inside one family, true, verifiable, completely unused for 400 years. The second ending is darker, and it is the reason none of it ever came to anything. Greenland did not last either. The colony ran for roughly 4.5 centuries, and then it went quiet. The climate cooled and the sea ice thickened and the sailing seasons got shorter at both ends. But the thing that actually killed it was not the weather. It was a market. Greenland's entire economy stood on one export: walrus ivory. That was the reason ships crossed at all. Greenlanders went north on brutal hunting voyages, took the tusks and shipped them to Europe, where they were carved into everything from chess pieces to reliquaries. That single trade paid for the timber, the iron, the grain, the tools, everything the colony could not make for itself. And then elephant ivory started flowing into Europe again through African trade routes. Bigger tusks, better material, cheaper. Picture the position that leaves you in. You live on a coast that cannot feed itself without imports. The imports arrive by ship. The ships come because you have something worth the crossing, and over 2 or 3 generations, the one thing you sell stops being worth anybody's crossing. The last written record from Norse Greenland is a wedding, a church in the eastern settlement in the year 1408. 2 people getting married, visitors from Iceland present, who wrote it down and then went home. That is the final thing anyone ever recorded about 4.5 centuries of people living on that coast. An ordinary day, a couple standing in a stone church that is still there, roofless now, with the sea behind it. Nobody in that building knew they were the last page. After that, nothing. No account of a final winter, no evacuation. When European ships came back to that coast generations later, they found empty farms and open churches, and nobody left to ask. The excavations turned up 2 details that are hard to shake off. The first is in the bones. In the last generations, the diet shifts almost entirely to the sea, to seals, as the farms fail. These were cattle people. Their whole identity was livestock and hay and milk, and at the end they were living on whatever they could pull out of the water. The second is in the walls. The houses show a pattern of shrinking, families sealing off rooms they could no longer heat, retreating into smaller and smaller warm spaces inside buildings their great-grandparents had raised when there was still enough of everything. Picture yourself blocking up a doorway in the house you were born in because there is no longer enough fuel to keep that part of it alive. That is where 4.5 centuries of your people ends up. And for the next 900 years, almost nobody believed a word of any of it. Understand the position these accounts were in. Written down 2 centuries after the events, out of oral memory, inside a body of literature that also contains a dead man sitting up to deliver prophecy, and, in the Vinland material itself, an encounter with a one-legged creature that shoots an arrow and hops away. Now imagine being a 19th century scholar handed a document containing a one-legged monster and a claim that medieval farmers reached America. Which half do you think gets thrown out? And it got worse, because the frauds arrived. Carved stones turning up in American fields with conveniently supportive inscriptions. Forged maps. The most famous of them was unveiled at Yale in the 1960s to enormous excitement, and eventually shown to be a fake, the ink itself giving it away. Every hoax made serious scholars more allergic to the entire subject. So this is where the story sat by the middle of the 20th century, an entire body of written testimony describing specific voyages by named people to a named land, dismissed by most of the academic world, partly because too many liars had got there first. And then a Norwegian couple decided to do the one thing nobody serious had been willing to do for 9 centuries. They decided to believe it. He was an explorer and a writer. She was an archaeologist. And their method in the early 1960s was so simple it is almost embarrassing. They read the sagas as sailing directions, not as literature, not as folklore with a kernel buried somewhere inside, as directions. 2 days sail from here, a sound between an island and a headland, shallow at low tide, grass down to the water. They took 1,000-year-old text at its word and went looking for the coast it described. And then they did the thing that actually found it, which was not clever at all. They went harbour to harbour along the coast of eastern Canada in a small boat, and they asked local fishermen one question. Are there any old ruins around here that nobody can explain? Village after village, nothing, nothing, nothing. And then, at the very northern tip of Newfoundland, in a fishing village called Lonceau Meadows, they asked it again, and a man who lived there said yes. Yes, actually. There is a place like that, just outside town. Some overgrown ridges in the grass. People had always assumed they were old indigenous sites, or an abandoned fishing station, or nothing at all. Locals had walked past them for generations on the way down to their boats. Nobody had ever put a shovel in them. Take a second here, because whatever else happens in your life, you will probably never have a moment quite like the one about to happen to those two people. They dug. And what came out of that ground ended 900 years of argument. 8 turf-walled buildings, laid out in a pattern that matched Norse construction in Iceland and Greenland and matched nothing indigenous. 3 large halls with living quarters and workshops around them. A smithy with a stone anvil and iron slag, where somebody had smelted bog iron and made nails. That single building carries more weight than almost anything else on the site, because iron smelting was completely unknown in the pre-contact Americas. Nobody else on this continent was doing it. It is a European fingerprint that cannot be argued around. A spindle whorl, the small carved disc used for spinning wool, quiet and enormous, because spinning was women's work in Norse society. This was not a raiding party. Women were here. A bronze cloak pin of Norse type, a whetstone, boat rivets, piles of wood chips and cut timber, the debris of an active lumber operation, and the buildings had been repaired. Somebody stayed long enough for things to need fixing. The sagas were not myth. They were memory. Imperfect, reshaped, with 2 centuries of retelling laid over the top of it, but memory of something that actually happened. And then, 6 decades later, the last gap closed in the most elegant way anybody could have designed. In the year 993, an enormous burst of cosmic radiation, most likely a solar storm, struck the Earth. Every living tree on the planet absorbed the spike and locked it into that year's growth ring. Germany, Ireland, Arizona, Japan, everywhere. One global timestamp buried in wood, all over the world. Researchers took 3 pieces of wood from Lonso Meadows, from 3 different trees, all from Norse contexts, all showing clean-cut marks from metal blades that nobody else on this continent possessed. They found the 93 ring in each one, and then they counted, ring by ring outward from that spike to the bark edge, because the bark edge is the year the tree died, the year somebody swung something at it. 28 rings, 3 separate trees, 3 separate samples, and every single one of them landed on the same number. The year 1021, not a range, not a probability with a margin of decades. One specific year, exactly 1,000 years before the study was published, in which Norse people stood on that ground and cut those trees with iron blades. 900 years of doubt, undone by counting rings. So we have it. The site, the buildings, the forge, the spindle whorl, the exact year. And this is where I have to tell you the thing that keeps this whole story open, and it is what I want going into your sleep tonight. Lonso Meadows is almost certainly not Vinland. Look at where it sits, the very northern tip of Newfoundland. Now remember what Vinland was named for. Grapes. Wild grapes, on a hillside, in enough quantity to put an old man on the ground for an afternoon. Grapes do not grow there. They do not grow anywhere near there. The climate is wrong, and it is wrong by hundreds of miles. And it is not only the grapes. The excavators found butternuts on the site. Butternuts do not grow in Newfoundland either, and never have. The nearest range is well to the south, around New Brunswick and the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Somebody at that settlement had been south, properly south, and carried nuts back. So the reading most archaeologists now hold, and it is the one the evidence best supports, is that Lonso Meadows was never the destination at all. It was the gateway, a base at the mouth of the Gulf, a place to repair ships and winter over and stage timber, from which the Norse went on, further down the coast, into the real country the accounts describe, which means the place in the story has never been found. The sound where the tide went out and 35 men climbed over the side rather than wait. The river with the impossible fish. The hillside where an old man walked into the taste of his own childhood and could not stand up. The headland a dying man looked at and said he wanted to live on, where his crew put a cross at his head and a cross at his feet and made the first European grave in this hemisphere. The meadow where milk was traded for fur across an impossible language gap, and where a bull came out of the trees and ended it. The open ground where a pregnant woman picked up a sword and stopped an army for reasons nobody has ever explained. None of it, not one of those places, has ever been located. It is out there, somewhere south of the site we did find. Under 1,000 years of forest or a farmer's field or somebody's back garden or a car park, and people are looking right now. That search is active. There is a real chance that in your lifetime, somebody finds it. Two things are true here, and neither one cancels out the other, and there is no prize for forcing them into a single tidy lesson before you fall asleep. It is true that a colony of a few thousand people, hanging onto the edge of the habitable world with no compass and no charts, crossed an unmapped ocean in open boats carrying cattle, and built houses on a continent Europe did not know existed. It is true that a woman crossed that ocean 8 times and gave birth on the far side of it. It is true that after they buried a brother out there, they went back and then went back again, and it took a defeat to stop them. Whatever else that was, it was not small. And it is equally true that the very first thing this expedition did on meeting the people of this continent was kill 8 of them in their sleep, with no reason recorded in any source that survives, and that everything afterward flowed out of that morning. It is true that the land was never empty and never available, and was never waiting for anyone. It is true that the colony did not fail because of storms or bad luck, but because the people who lived there defended their own coast and won. And it is true that the Norse said so themselves in the oldest account we have, in one flat sentence. The land was good, and they could not stay, because it already belonged to someone who would not have them. You do not have to settle that tonight. Some stories are more honest if you carry both halves into sleep unresolved. We started this one on cold shingle, with a young man buying a second-hand boat because of where it had already been. We went west with him into a fog that took away everything he had to steer by. We stood on a dead grey coast with nothing living on it, and sailed past a wall of timber that made men from a treeless country go quiet at the rail, and came into a shallow sound where 35 people climbed over the side and waded ashore rather than sit still for one more afternoon. We watched an old man vanish into a forest nobody had mapped, and come back out of it laughing, having found his childhood growing wild on a hillside. Then we watched it turn. A grain store in a clearing that nobody stopped to think about. A broken keel on a beach. 9 men asleep under their own boats at the edge of a morning. An arrow that came back for it seasons later, and a grave on a headland a man had admired out loud. A whole summer lost on an ocean with no way to find land. Cattle standing in the dark of an open hold. A child born into a working peace. A bull in the trees. A woman alone on a field with a sword. And then ships that simply stopped going quietly, with no ending worth writing down. Some of it is still hanging open, and you are welcome to leave it hanging while your eyes close. Whether Leif understood, that very first spring, exactly what he had started, and exactly why he would spend 20 years watching the ice break up and never go. What those 9 men on the beach were dreaming about in whatever last unwarned moment they had, and what their names were, and who was waiting for them to come home. Whether Freydis did what the text says she did, and if she did, what on earth those men thought they were looking at, and whether, somewhere under a forest that has had 1,000 years to close over it, a hearthstone is sitting in the dark tonight, cold and patient, exactly where somebody left it, waiting for a shovel that has not arrived yet. Nobody has answered that last one. Somebody still might. Here is what you can hold on to on the way out. The salmon are still running up those rivers every autumn, thick and heavy, exactly as they were the season a crew of Greenlanders waded ashore without waiting for the tide. Somewhere south of the ruins we did find wild grapevines are almost certainly still tangled through the underbrush, ripening every year for nobody in particular, the way they were the afternoon an old man walked into them, and the low green outlines of 8 buildings are still sitting quietly in the grass at the top of Newfoundland, for anyone willing to make the trip and stand there. If this kept you company tonight, a quiet tap on the like button tells me these are worth building. That is all it does, and it helps more than you would guess. If you want the next one, subscribing is the whole mechanism, and I will keep going after the checkable, stranger than the textbook version of stories like this one, at exactly this unhurried pace for as long as you will have me. And since this whole voyage turned on a coastline, I would like to know. Tell me in the comments whether you are falling asleep near water tonight or nowhere near it, which city, and what time it happens to be there right now. Let the hearthstone stay hidden a while longer. Let the grapes ripen wherever they actually are. The argument about who found this coast first, and who it already belonged to long before anybody found anything, has waited 1,000 years, and it can wait through one more quiet night while you sleep. Rest easy. Wherever that unfound shoreline actually lies tonight, the tide is still coming in on it, on schedule, the same as it has every night for the last 1,000 years, whether or not a single person is standing there to watch it.